The morning mist clung to the frozen grassland like the breath of dying spirits, and Kira could taste the metallic edge of violence in the air before she heard the first war cry. She pressed herself against the jagged outcrop of granite, her calloused fingers gripping the leather pouch of winter roots she'd been gathering since dawn. The sound came again, a deep, guttural roar that made her heavy brow furrow with recognition and dread. Her band was fighting. Through the grey haze, she could make out the dark silhouettes of men locked in brutal combat near the riverbank, where the mammoth bones lay scattered from last week's successful hunt. Grok's massive frame was unmistakable even at this distance, his thick arms wielding a bone club with devastating efficiency. Beside him, young Dag moved with the desperate fury of someone fighting for his first right to mate, his lean muscles coiled beneath skin, darkened by soot and dried blood. But there were others, strangers whose scent didn't belong to their territory, whose war paint told stories of different caves and different ancestors. A rival band had come for their hunting grounds, just as the elders had feared during the long, hungry nights when the mammoth herds had grown scarce. Kira's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched a stranger break away from the melee, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. He was young, perhaps her own age, with the broad shoulders and thick bones of a born hunter. His dark hair was matted with mud and gore, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Yet he moved with purpose, not retreat, heading directly toward the hidden cache, where her band stored their precious flint tools. Without thinking, Kira hefted a river stone and hurled it with the accuracy that had made her the finest gatherer of her generation. The rock struck the intruder's temple with a wet crack, and he stumbled, going down hard on his knees. For a moment their eyes met across the distance, his dark and filled with a strange mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. Then Grok's war cry split the air again, and the young raider's bandmates were retreating, dragging their wounded with them across the frozen stream. But this one, this bleeding, broken young hunter, had fallen too far from his companions. He tried to crawl toward the water, leaving a dark trail in the frost-killed grass, but his strength was failing. Kira found herself moving before her mind could form a clear thought. She emerged from behind the granite outcrop, her gathering stick raised like a weapon, and approached the fallen stranger. Up close, she could see the family resemblance stamped in his heavy features, the prominent brow ridge, the thick jaw, the deep-set eyes that marked him as one of the Riverstone people who'd been encroaching on their territory for 3 seasons. "You fight well for a female," he gasped in the old tongue that all bands shared for trading and war talk. Blood frothed at the corner of his mouth, and she could see the unnatural rise and fall of his chest that spoke of broken ribs piercing deep places. "You steal poorly for a hunter," she replied, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. The sounds of combat were fading now as his bandmates disappeared into the morning haze, but she knew Grok and the others would be here soon to claim their prisoner or to finish what the battle had started. The young raider's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "I am Thane of the Riverstones. My father is Korak the Bear-Killer." He said it not with boastfulness, but with the simple dignity of someone stating facts before death. "I am Kira of the Bone Cave Band," she heard herself say. "My grandfather was Urtho the Farwalker." "Urtho?" Thane's eyes widened slightly. "The stories say he once saved a Riverstone child from ice bears." Before Kira could respond, heavy footsteps crunched through the frost behind her. She turned to see Grok approaching, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale morning sky. His club dripped with the blood of Thane's bandmates, and his small, intelligent eyes held the cold calculation of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the effort to kill. "He is mine," Grok rumbled, his voice carrying the authority of the band's strongest hunter. "I broke his arm. I drove his people away. The killing right belongs to me." Kira stepped sideways, not quite blocking Grok's path but making her presence impossible to ignore. "He knows things," she said quickly, "about the Riverstones, about where the herds might winter." Thane's eyes flickered to her face, and she saw understanding pass between them like a spark jumping across dry kindling. He was choosing to trust her with his life, and she was choosing to risk her standing in the band for a stranger who'd tried to steal from them. "Information," she continued, meeting Grok's skeptical stare. "Valuable information that dies with him, if you split his skull now." Grok's grip tightened on his club, but his small eyes were thoughtful. Winter was coming, and the mammoth herds had grown unpredictable. Knowledge was sometimes worth more than blood, especially when that knowledge might mean the difference between a full belly and starvation when the deep cold arrived. We take him, Grok decided finally. But if he proves useless, your compassion buys his pain, not his life, and you'll be the one to decide when he's suffered enough. As Darg and the other hunters arrived to bind Thane's wrists with twisted sinew, Kira felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders like a boulder she'd have to carry until spring. She'd saved a life today, but she'd also bound her fate to that of a dying stranger whose people would return for revenge the moment they gathered strength. The morning mist was clearing, and in the growing light, she could see her future branching into paths she'd never imagined walking. Some led to wisdom and survival. Others led to ashes and broken bones scattered across frozen ground. She only hoped she'd have the strength to choose the right one when the time came. The Bone Cave Band's shelter lay nestled in a natural cleft of limestone that had protected Kira's people for 7 generations. Ancient smoke stains blackened the ceiling where countless fires had burned, and the walls bore the carved marks of her ancestors, simple lines and circles that recorded successful hunts and harsh winters survived. Here, in the deepest recess where the wounded and dying were kept, Thane lay bound with mammoth hide ropes, his breathing shallow and labored. Kira knelt beside him, offering water from a carved gourd. The other band members watched from the shadows. Mira, the wise woman with her scarred face and knowing eyes, young Brack, who'd lost his father to a saber-tooth last spring, and Vera, the heavy mother whose swollen belly carried her 4th child through another dangerous winter. Their faces showed the careful neutrality of people waiting to see whether Kira's gamble would pay off or cost them all dearly. "The fever will take him by dawn if his wounds fester," Mira announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen death come for half the band over the years. She'd set Thane's broken arm with practiced efficiency, but the internal injuries were beyond her healing arts. "Whatever he knows dies with him unless he speaks soon." Grok crouched beside Kira, his massive hands making the bone needle in his grip look like a twig. He'd been working on new spear points since returning from the battle, but his attention was fixed on their prisoner. "The river stones know our hunting patterns," he said quietly. "They knew exactly when to strike, exactly where to find our cache. That's not luck, that's planning." Thane's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on the circle of faces surrounding him. Despite his pain, Kira could see the intelligence in his gaze as he assessed each person, cataloguing their strengths, their weapons, their positions. Even dying, he remained a hunter evaluating prey. "Water," he whispered, and Kira brought the gourd to his lips again. He drank slowly, his throat working with effort. When he'd finished, his eyes found hers. "Your grandfather, Urtho. He saved my sister when she was very small. River bears had taken her across the ice, but he followed their tracks for 3 days." "That's just a story," Brack interrupted, but Vera shushed him sharply. Everyone knew that Urtho's legendary tracking skills had kept the band fed during the worst winters within living memory. "No story," Thane continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "My sister is Nara the Swiftfoot. She leads our scouting parties now. She remembers being carried home on the shoulders of a stranger who asked nothing in return but safe passage to rejoin his own people." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Among the scattered bands that survived in these harsh lands, debts of blood and honor were currency more valuable than flint or fire. If Urtho had indeed saved a Riverstone child, then Thane's people owed Kira's family a life debt that passed down through generations. Mira leaned forward, her scarred features thoughtful. "If this is true, then why did your people attack us? Why steal from those you owe?" Thane's laugh was bitter, cut short by a spasm of pain that left him gasping. "Because we're starving," he managed finally. "The mammoths have changed their paths. They no longer follow the old routes our fathers hunted. We've found only empty ground where great herds should be." "The herds have shifted west," Vera said slowly, her hand resting protectively on her pregnant belly. "Following the ice melt toward the great waters. Our scouts have seen their tracks." "West is Stonebreaker territory," Grok rumbled. "They'll kill any hunter who enters their lands." "Not if you know the old paths," Thane said, his eyes bright with fever and desperate hope. "The hidden ways that follow the river valleys beneath the ridgelines. My grandmother was Stonebreaker born before she was taken by my grandfather in a mating raid. She taught me the secret signs that mark safe passage." Kira felt her heart skip as she realized what he was offering. The Stonebreakers controlled the richest hunting grounds in the known world, but their warriors were legendary for their brutality toward trespassers. If Thane truly knew safe routes through their territory, it could mean the difference between another hungry winter and the feast that would carry both bands through to spring. But the cost would be steep. Trusting a prisoner meant risking not just their lives but their children's future. And if Thane was lying, if this was some elaborate deception to lead them into an ambush, then Kira's moment of compassion would doom everyone she'd ever loved. "You offer much for a dying man," she said carefully. "What do you want in return?" Thane's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not the desperation of someone bargaining for life, but the quiet dignity of someone who'd already accepted death and was now concerned with how he'd be remembered. "Time," he said simply. "Enough time to see my debt to your family properly paid. My knowledge for your grandfather's kindness, given freely with no expectation of reward." He paused, his breathing labored. "And when death comes for me, I want it to come with honor, not as a captive dying in chains, but as a hunter who served his purpose to the end." The request hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Kira could feel the weight of her bandmates' stares, the pressure of a decision that would ripple through their lives for seasons to come. Grok's face was unreadable, but she knew he was calculating odds the way any good hunter did, measuring risk against reward, survival against compassion. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the distant howls of wolves already growing bold as winter approached. Time was running short for all of them, and the choices made in the next few heartbeats would determine who lived to see another spring and who would be left behind as offerings to the hungry cold. Kira looked into Thane's eyes one more time, searching for deception, for the subtle signs that would mark him as a liar. Instead, she found only the quiet resolution of someone who'd already chosen his path and was waiting to see if she had the courage to walk beside him. "We accept," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Your knowledge for our protection, your honor for our trust." Grok's grunt might have been approval or resignation, but he nodded slowly. "Then we hunt together," he said, "and may the ancestors forgive us if we're wrong." 3 days passed before Thane was strong enough to sit upright without assistance, and already the first snow had begun to dust the high ridges like bone meal scattered across dark stone. Kira found herself returning to his side more often than necessity required, drawn by something she couldn't name, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the growing realization that this stranger carried knowledge that could reshape her people's destiny. He was sketching in the dirt with a charred stick, his movements careful and precise despite the weakness that still plagued him. The other band members gathered around, their expressions ranging from fascination to deep suspicion. Even Grok crouched nearby, his massive frame tense with the wariness of a predator, encountering something new and potentially dangerous. "Here," Thane said, pointing to a curved line that represented the great river. "The Stonebreakers post sentries at every ford during hunting season, but the old paths follow the water beneath the cliffs, where cave mouths hide passages carved by our ancestors' ancestors." He traced a series of connected dots along the river's edge. Each cave bears marks, 3 circles for safe passage, crossed lines for danger, spiral patterns for fresh water springs. Vera shifted her weight, one hand supporting her growing belly. "And if we meet Stonebreaker hunters anyway, your grandmother's symbols won't stop their spears." "The deep paths are forbidden to them too," Thane replied, his dark eyes serious. "They're sacred ways, watched over by the spirits of the first people. No Stonebreaker will follow you there unless his need is desperate beyond all measure." Young Brack snorted with derision. "Spirits don't fill empty bellies, and sacred paths don't protect against arrows in the back." But Mira, the wise woman, leaned forward, her scarred features thoughtful. "The old ways carry power," she said slowly. "I've seen places where even the bravest hunters turn back without knowing why. Perhaps the ancients knew things we've forgotten." Kira watched Thane's face as he listened to the debate swirling around him. There was no desperation in his expression, no sign of someone fabricating stories to save his own life. Instead, she saw the quiet confidence of someone sharing knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that carried the weight of survival through countless harsh winters. "Show us more," she said, ignoring the sharp look Grok shot in her direction. "The mammoth herds? Where do they winter when the ice grows thick?" Thane's stick moved across the dirt again, this time sketching a rough oval surrounded by radiating lines. "The warm valley, 3 days' journey beyond Stonebreaker lands. Underground springs keep the ground from freezing, and the grass stays green even when snow covers the high country. The herds gather there from all directions. Mammoth, giant elk, cave bears seeking winter dens." "That's half a season's travel," Dag protested. "We'd have to leave before the next full moon, and there's no guarantee we could find our way back before the deep cold sets in. Or that we'd survive the journey at all," added Brack, his young voice sharp with skepticism. Riverstone hunters could be waiting in ambush at any point along the way. This could all be an elaborate trap. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire, and Kira saw Thane's jaw tighten with suppressed anger. But when he spoke, his voice remained level, controlled. "If I wanted you dead, I would have told you nothing and let Winter do the killing for me," he said quietly. "Dead people can't hunt mammoth or trade for flint. My band needs yours alive and strong, just as yours needs mine." "Your band?" Grok's voice carried a dangerous undertone. "You speak as if you expect to return to them." Thane met the big hunter's stare without flinching. "I expect to die before the snow melts," he said simply. "The wounds go too deep, and I can feel the cold settling into my bones. But my death will have meaning if it serves both our peoples." The honesty of his words seemed to surprise everyone, including Kira. She'd grown accustomed to thinking of him as someone fighting for survival, but now she realized he'd accepted his fate from the beginning. Everything he offered came not from desperation, but from a deeper purpose, the desire to transform his death into something that could nurture life. "There's more," he continued, his voice growing weaker as the effort of speaking took its toll. "The valley holds other treasures. Caves filled with red ochre for ceremony paint, deposits of good stone for tool-making, hot springs where the sick can heal and women can birth safely even in deep winter." Vera's eyes widened at this last detail. Her previous 2 children had been born during harsh seasons, and one had died before his first breath. The promise of a warm, safe place to deliver her 4th child was worth almost any risk. But Grok remained skeptical. "And the Stonebreakers simply allow outsiders to harvest these treasures. They've built no defenses, claimed no territory." "The Stonebreakers fear the valley," Thane admitted. "Their legends speak of the first people who built great fires there in the ancient times. They believe the spirits of the fire builders still guard the warm places, punishing any who take more than they need." "Superstition," Brack muttered, but Mira shook her head. "Caution born of wisdom," the old healer corrected. "The Stonebreakers have survived longer than any other band in the known world. If they avoid a place, there's usually good reason." Kira found herself caught between hope and fear, between the promise of abundance and the threat of annihilation. Everything Thane described sounded too good to be true. A paradise hidden beyond the reach of enemies, protected by ancient taboos and supplied by the Earth's own warmth. But if even half of what he claimed was real, it could transform their lives from a constant struggle for survival into something approaching prosperity. "We need proof," she said finally. "Something more than stories and sketches in the dirt." Thane nodded, as if he'd been expecting this demand. With great effort, he reached inside his torn hide clothing and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. His movements were careful, reverent, as he unwrapped what lay within. It was a piece of stone unlike any Kira had ever seen. Translucent green shot through with veins of gold, warm to the touch even in the cave's chill air. The moment the light hit it, the stone seemed to glow with its own inner fire. "Valley stone," Thane whispered. "It only forms where the earth's blood runs hot beneath the surface. My grandmother carried this piece her entire life, and her grandmother before her." He extended it toward Kira with trembling hands. "Take it. When you see the cliffs of the warm valley, you'll find stones like this scattered along the shores of every hot spring." Kira accepted the stone, feeling its unexpected warmth spread through her palm. Around her, the band members leaned closer, their breath misting in the cold air as they studied this tangible proof of Thane's claims. Whatever skepticism remained was tempered now by the undeniable reality of holding something that shouldn't exist, a piece of summer's warmth preserved in stone. Outside the cave, the wind was picking up, carrying the promise of harder weather to come. Time was running short, and soon they would have to choose, trust in the knowledge of a dying stranger, or face another winter with their dwindling resources and pray the cold would be merciful. Kira closed her fingers around the warm stone and felt the weight of her people's future settling into her palm, like an ember that could either light their way to salvation or burn everything they held dear to ash. The band council convened as the last light of day died behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the cave mouth where Kira's ancestors had made similar life-or-death decisions for countless generations. The sacred talking stone, a piece of black obsidian worn smooth by hundreds of hands, passed from person to person as each member spoke their thoughts into the flickering firelight. Grok held the stone first, his massive fingers making it look like a pebble. "Winter comes early this season," he rumbled, his voice echoing off the limestone walls. "The signs are clear. Thicker fur on the rabbits, birds flying south before their time, ice forming in the morning pools. If we stay, we hunt the same exhausted grounds as last winter, and we barely survived that. He passed the stone to Vera, whose swollen belly made sitting uncomfortable on the hard cave floor. "My child will be born within 2 moon cycles," she said, one hand protectively cradling her unborn daughter. "If the valley is real, if the hot springs exist, my baby could enter the world in warmth instead of freezing darkness. That alone makes the risk worth taking." Young Brack took the stone next, his jaw set with the stubborn defiance of someone whose opinions had rarely been valued. "We know nothing about this Thane except what he tells us. Riverstone warriors could be waiting at every turn of the secret path. We could be walking into a trap that will destroy our entire bloodline." "And what of staying?" Mira the wise woman asked when the stone reached her scarred hands. "I've lived through 7 harsh winters, and this one promises to be the worst. Our stored food won't last until spring melt, the herds have moved beyond our reach, and the Riverstones know our hunting patterns too well. Death waits for us here, just as surely as it might on the journey." Dag, still bearing scars from the recent battle, weighed the obsidian thoughtfully before speaking. "If we go, some of us will die. If we stay, all of us might. The choice seems clear to me." When the stone finally reached Kira's hands, she felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her. Every person who had ever held this talking stone in times of crisis had faced the same fundamental question: how much risk was acceptable to ensure survival? How much trust could be placed in hope? "I've watched Thane for 4 days, she began, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "I've seen no deception in his eyes, no calculation beyond the simple desire to repay an old debt with honor. The Valley Stone is real. I can feel its warmth even now. And if we're going to die anyway, isn't it better to die moving toward hope than sitting still in despair?" She placed the stone in the center of their circle and looked around at the faces of her people, her family, in all but blood, bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. Whatever they decided tonight would echo through the ages, either as the beginning of a new chapter in their survival or as the final mistake that ended their story forever. "We vote," Grok announced, following the old custom, "all in favor of trusting the Riverstone prisoner and attempting the journey to his warm valley." One by one, hands rose into the firelight, Vera first, driven by maternal instinct, then Dag, scarred and young and hungry for adventure. Mira followed, her healer's wisdom recognizing that desperate times called for desperate remedies. Finally, reluctantly, even Brack raised his hand, not out of conviction, but out of recognition that staying meant certain doom. Only Grok hesitated, his small, intelligent eyes reflecting the dancing flames. As the band's strongest hunter, the responsibility for their safety rested heaviest on his broad shoulders. If they died because of this decision, their blood would stain his hands. But finally, slowly, his massive arm lifted toward the cave ceiling. "It's decided then," he said quietly. "We leave with the dawn, following paths marked by a dying enemy toward a valley that may or may not exist." His laugh was bitter, but not without humor. "Our ancestors would think us either very brave or very foolish, perhaps both," Mira observed, already gathering her healing supplies and sacred bundles. "But they faced the same choice countless times, trust in the unknown or accept certain destruction. We're no different from them." As the band dispersed to prepare for their journey, Kira found herself drawn back to Thane's side. He lay propped against the cave wall, his breathing labored but his eyes alert. The valley stone rested in his palm, casting its strange inner light across his weathered features. "They've agreed to trust you," she told him quietly. "We leave at first light." "Good," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "But I won't see the valley again. The fever is spreading, and I can feel the cold reaching deeper into my bones with each breath." Kira felt a strange pang at his words. Not quite grief, but something approaching it. Over the past few days she'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet intelligence in his eyes, and the dignity with which he faced his approaching death. "You could recover," she said, though they both knew it was false hope. "The journey might strengthen you." Thane shook his head slowly. "My purpose was never to reach the valley alive. My purpose was to ensure others could find it." He pressed the warm stone into her hand, his fingers cold against her skin. "When I can no longer guide you, follow the markers I've described. Trust the ancient ways, and they'll lead you true." Outside, the wind was picking up again, carrying the scent of snow and the distant howls of predators. growing bold as winter tightened its grip. Soon they would be traveling through that hostile darkness, trusting their lives to paths carved by people whose names had been forgotten for generations. But for now, in the warmth of the cave that had sheltered her people since before memory, Kira held a piece of impossible stone and listened to the quiet breathing of a man who was giving his life to save strangers. Whatever tomorrow brought, triumph or disaster, salvation or doom, tonight they were still alive, still together, still capable of hope. And sometimes, in a world as harsh as theirs, hope was the most precious treasure of all. The preparations continued through the night as each member of the band gathered their most essential possessions, tools, weapons, sacred objects, and what little food they could carry. By dawn, they would be committed to a path that led either to abundance beyond imagining or to death in the frozen wasteland between their old life and their dreams. Kira closed her eyes and felt the valley stone's warmth spreading through her palm like a promise whispered by the earth itself. In a few hours she would learn whether that promise was real or merely the last cruel joke of a world that had never shown mercy to the weak. Dawn broke grey and cold over the limestone cliffs as the Bone Cave band prepared to abandon the only home most of them had ever known. Kira shouldered her gathering pack, dried roots, healing herbs, the precious fire-making stones that could mean the difference between warmth and death, and cast one last look at the cave mouth where 7 generations of her ancestors had weathered the worst storms winter could bring. Thane lay on a makeshift travois constructed from mammoth ribs and hide, his face pale but his eyes bright with fever and determination. Grok had fashioned the stretcher with grudging skill, muttering about the burden of carrying a dying enemy into unknown dangers. But even the big hunter couldn't argue with the necessity. Thane's knowledge was their only hope of navigating the secret paths safely. "The first marker is half a day's walk," Thane whispered as Darg and Brack lifted the travois. His voice was weaker than yesterday, but his directions remained precise. "Follow the river upstream until you see the standing stone that looks like a crouching bear. The hidden path begins in the shadow it casts at midday." The band moved out in single file, with Grok leading and Kira walking beside the travois. Vera followed behind, her pregnant belly making each step an effort, while Mira brought up the rear with her herb pouches and healing supplies. The morning air bit at their faces, carrying the sharp scent of snow that could begin falling at any moment. As they left familiar territory behind, Kira felt the weight of their decisions settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. Every step took them further from safety and deeper into the unknown. The landscape around them seemed to watch their passage with hostile eyes, jagged rocks that could hide ambushes, twisted trees whose branches reached out like grasping fingers, shadows that moved with no apparent source. "There," Thane said when the sun had climbed to its peak, pointing with trembling fingers toward a weathered pillar of stone that did indeed resemble a great bear frozen in the act of drinking from the river. "The marker." Grok approached the standing stone with the wariness of a hunter entering enemy territory. His massive hands traced the carved symbols that were barely visible after countless seasons of wind and rain. 3 interlocked circles surrounded by lines that curved like flowing water. "Ancient work," he rumbled, his voice carrying new respect. "Older than our oldest stories. The first people carved these markers when the world was young and the ice reached to the southern seas," Thane explained, his breathing labored from the morning's travel. "Each symbol tells part of the path, where to find water, how to avoid the deep places where cave bears den, which routes are safe during different seasons." Kira studied the carved stone, trying to memorize every line and curve. Soon, perhaps within days, these markers would be their only guide through territory, where a single wrong turn could lead to starvation or death at the hands of stonebreaker warriors. The hidden path itself was almost invisible, a narrow track that wound between boulders and disappeared into a cleft in the cliffs. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would have noticed the subtle signs that marked it as a route rather than a random geological formation. "Stay close," Grok ordered as they began the ascent. "One at a time through the narrow places. If we meet trouble, there's nowhere to run." The path climbed steadily upward, following ledges carved from living rock by people whose names had been forgotten before Kira's great-grandmother was born. In places, the way was so narrow that they had to turn sideways to pass, the travois scraping against stone walls worn smooth by countless generations of travelers. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, carrying the first scattered snowflakes of the approaching storm. Thane's condition was visibly worsening. His skin had taken on a grey pallor, and his breathing was becoming increasingly shallow, but his eyes remained alert, constantly scanning the path ahead for the next marker that would guide them safely through the maze of ancient passages. "The Stonebreakers patrol the high country," he warned, as they paused to rest on a ledge overlooking a vast valley. "But they avoid this particular route. Their legends say it's haunted by the spirits of the fire builders who first carved these ways." Brack laughed nervously. "And what do you believe? Are we walking through a path of ghosts?" Thane was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I believe the ancients knew things we've forgotten. Perhaps they built protections into these paths, not spirits but something else. Warnings that speak to the deepest parts of our minds, telling us to turn back from places we don't understand." As if summoned by his words, a low sound echoed through the cliffs, not quite wind, not quite animal cry, but something that made the hair on the back of Kira's neck rise with primitive alarm. Even Grok tensed, his hand moving instinctively to his weapons. "The voice of the deep places," Mira said quietly, her scarred features solemn. "I've heard it before, in caves where the earth spirits dwell. It means we're walking on sacred ground." The sound faded, leaving only the whistle of wind through stone and the distant rumble of falling water. But the sense of being watched remained, not with hostile intent, but with the patient attention of something ancient and powerful that was measuring their worthiness to pass through its domain. As evening approached, they found shelter in a natural cave carved into the cliff face. The entrance was marked with more symbols, spirals and intersecting lines that seemed to shift and flow in the dancing firelight. Inside, the cave was surprisingly warm, as if heated by some hidden source deep within the earth. "We're on the right path," Thane said, as Kira helped him drink water from their diminishing supply. His voice was barely a whisper now, but his eyes still held that fierce determination to see his mission through. "Tomorrow we reach the disputed lands between the Riverstones and the Stonebreakers. After that, only the ancient paths will keep us safe." Outside their shelter, the wind howled with increasing fury as the first real storm of winter began to descend on the high country. Snow hissed against the cave entrance, and somewhere in the darkness, wolves howled their hunger to the uncaring stars. But inside the ancient cave, warmed by earth heat that their ancestors had discovered thousands of winters ago, the Bone Cave Band huddled around their small fire and tried not to think about how far they were from everything they'd ever known. They were committed now, too far from home to turn back, too far from their destination to guarantee they would ever arrive. All they could do was trust in the knowledge of a dying stranger and hope that the path carved by forgotten hands would lead them to salvation rather than to their graves in the frozen wilderness. Kira pulled her fur cloak tighter around her shoulders and listened to the storm building outside. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, and perhaps new revelations about the mysterious valley that had become their desperate goal. But tonight they were still alive, still together, still moving toward hope, and in a world where hope was the rarest treasure of all, that was enough. The second day brought heavier snow and a bitter wind that cut through their fur cloaks like flint knives. Thane had not spoken since dawn, his breathing so shallow that Kira had to lean close to his chest to confirm he still lived. The travois bounced and scraped over the rocky path, each jolt bringing soft moans of pain from the dying man, who had become their guide through this frozen maze. By midday, they had reached a fork in the ancient path, where two routes diverged around a massive boulder carved with weathered symbols. Without Thane's guidance, Grok called a halt, his small eyes studying both passages with the intensity of a hunter tracking wounded prey. "Left path climbs toward the peaks," he observed, his breath misting in the frigid air. "Right path descends into the valley between the ridges. Both show signs of old travel, but I can't read the markers." Kira knelt beside Thane and touched his shoulder gently. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly finding her face. When he tried to speak, only a whisper emerged, barely audible above the wind. "Which way?" she asked, leaning so close that her ear nearly touched his lips. "Right," he breathed. "Valley path, hidden from Stonebreaker scouts." His hand moved weakly toward the carved boulder, fingers tracing symbols that seemed to shimmer with meaning she couldn't grasp. "But danger, see, in the narrow places, old warnings carved by those who died learning." His voice faded entirely, and his eyes closed as if the effort of speech had drained what little strength remained to him. Kira felt her heart clench with something approaching panic. They had perhaps 2 more days of travel before reaching the borders of Stonebreaker territory, and after that, They would need precise knowledge of every safe step to avoid detection. "We should have made him draw maps," Brack muttered, his young face pinched with cold and fear. "Sketches we could follow when he's gone. Maps drawn by dying hands in a cave bear no resemblance to the real world," Mira replied sharply. "Knowledge lives in the mind and heart, not on pieces of bark." Vera shifted her weight uncomfortably, one hand supporting her swollen belly. "How much further to this valley of his? I can feel my time approaching, and birth in a snowstorm means death for both mother and child." The question hung in the air like smoke from a wet fire. None of them knew the answer with certainty. Only Thane possessed that crucial information, and he was slipping away from them like warmth bleeding from a dying ember. Grok made the decision with characteristic directness. "We take the right path," as he said. "If it leads to ambush or death, at least we'll die moving forward instead of freezing in place." He shouldered his pack and lifted the front of the travois. "Dag, take the other end. Kira, you walk beside him and listen for any other words he might speak." The descent into the valley proved treacherous from the first step. The path wound between towering walls of stone that blocked out most of the grey daylight, creating a twilight world where every shadow could hide threats. Ice made the footing uncertain, and more than once someone slipped and had to be caught by their companions before tumbling into the rocky depths below. As they travelled deeper into the narrow passage, Kira began to notice signs that made her skin crawl with primitive unease. Scattered bones gleamed white against the dark stone, some from animals, but others that might once have belonged to travellers who had taken wrong turns in this maze of ancient ways. The very air seemed to whisper warnings in languages older than speech. "This place has tasted blood," Mira observed quietly, her healer's eyes reading signs the others missed. "Many have died here over the generations. I can smell it in the stone." "Died how?" Brack asked, his voice tight with nervous energy. "Falls, mostly," the wise woman replied, examining a skull wedged between two rocks. "But some of these bones show cut marks, blade wounds. This passage has seen battles as well as accidents." The revelation sent ripples of tension through the small band. They were not just navigating treacherous terrain, they were walking through what might be an ancient killing ground, where generations of travellers had met violent ends. As if responding to their growing fear, Thane's eyes opened suddenly, bright with fever and urgent purpose. His hand shot out with surprising strength, grasping Kira's wrist with fingers that felt like ice. "Stop," he whispered, his voice carrying a clarity it had lacked for hours. "Wrong way. This isn't—" The path curves back on itself, leads to the boneyard where the failed ones lie. Grok set down his end of the travois immediately, his hunter's instincts responding to the alarm in Thane's voice. "Where then? Which direction?" With tremendous effort, Thane raised himself on one elbow, his fevered gaze scanning the stone walls around them. "There," he said, pointing with a shaking finger toward what appeared to be solid rock. "Hidden passage, behind the fallstone, marked with the sign of the serpent eating its own tail." Kira looked where he indicated and saw nothing but weathered granite. But when she approached the wall and let her hands explore the surface, she felt the subtle variation that marked a concealed opening, a crack just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, hidden behind a slab of stone that had fallen centuries ago. "How did you know?" she asked in wonder. Thane's smile was weak but genuine. "My grandmother brought me through here when I was very young, made me memorize, and every turn, every marker, said knowledge was the only inheritance that could never be stolen." The hidden passage proved to be another marvel of ancient engineering, a tunnel carved through solid rock, wide enough for the travois and high enough that even Grok could walk upright. The walls bore more symbols, spirals and interwoven patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light in the flickering glow of their torches. "The first people were greater than we imagined," Dag murmured, running his fingers along the precisely carved stone. "How did they cut passages like this with only stone tools?" "Perhaps they had knowledge we've lost," Mira suggested, secrets of working stone that died with them. As they emerged from the tunnel into daylight once again, Kira felt a profound sense of having passed through something more than mere distance. The quality of the light seemed different here, softer, warmer, touched with promise rather than threat. And in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, she could see steam rising from what could only be hot springs. "The border of the warm valley," Thane whispered, his voice filled with wonder and relief. "We've made it to the threshold. From here the path is clear and the springs will guide us true." But even as hope flared in Kira's heart, she could see that Thane's strength was finally failing. The effort of guiding them through the hidden ways had consumed what little life remained to him. His breathing was becoming irregular, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that she'd seen too often in the dying. They had reached the borders of salvation, but their guide would not live to see the paradise he had promised them. And somewhere in the growing darkness of her mind, Kira began to realize that Thane's greatest revelation, his final gift to them, still lay ahead. Whatever last desire burned in his failing heart, she sensed it would demand more of her than simple compassion. The warm valley waited before them like a dream made manifest, but the price of entering that dream was about to be revealed in ways that would test the very foundations of everything she believed about honor, loyalty, and the bonds that held her people together. The warm valley opened before them like a vision from the most fevered dreams of starving hunters. Steam rose from dozens of hot springs, scattered across emerald grassland that defied the season, creating a misty paradise where mammoth and giant elk grazed peacefully in the perpetual twilight of the deep gorge. The air itself seemed to pulse with life, warm, humid, rich with the scent of growing things that should have been impossible in the depths of winter. Vera gasped and sank to her knees, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "It's real," she whispered. "By all the ancestors, it's real." Even Grok stood speechless, his small intelligent eyes taking in details that his hunter's mind could barely process. Herds of game animals moved without fear through the valley bottom, their thick winter coats steaming in the humid air. Cave bears denned peacefully near thermal pools, their massive forms relaxed and well-fed. And everywhere, the impossible green of grass that grew year-round, nourished by the earth's own warmth. "The legends called it the Heart Valley," Thane managed to say, his voice barely a whisper as they carried his travois down the gentle slope toward the nearest hot springs, where the earth bleeds warmth instead of ice, and the first people learned to shape stone with fire. Kira helped lower the travois beside a pool whose waters glowed with mineral deposits that caught and reflected the steam-filtered sunlight. The warmth radiating from the spring felt like a blessing against her frozen hands, and she could see fish moving lazily in the crystal-clear depths, fat, slow creatures that had never known the fear of starvation. "How is this possible?" Darg asked, kneeling to touch the warm water with wonder. "The snow falls thick on the rim above, but here it melts before it touches the ground." Mira the wise woman was already examining the thermal pools with her healer's eye, noting the different colors and mineral content of each spring. "Earth blood," she said softly. "The very bones of the world run hot here, keeping winter at bay. I've heard stories of such places, but never believed they could be real." As the band spread out to explore their new sanctuary, Kira remained beside Thane, watching the play of emotions across his grey features. Relief warred with sadness in his fevered eyes, and she sensed that their arrival in the valley was bringing both fulfillment and new anguish to his dying heart. "Your people could live here too," she said gently. "The valley is vast enough for many bands. When you recover—" "I won't recover," Thane interrupted, his voice gaining strength from some inner reserve she hadn't known he possessed. "And my people are already here." Kira's blood turned to ice in her veins. "What do you mean?" With tremendous effort, Thane raised himself on one elbow and pointed toward the far end of the valley, where the mists grew thick around a cluster of natural caves. "We arrived 7 days ago," he whispered. "My father, my sister, 40 others from our band. They're camped at the far springs, waiting." The words hit Kira like a physical blow. "You knew? All this time you knew they were here?" "I knew," Thane confirmed, his eyes never leaving her face. "The raid on your hunting grounds was desperation, yes, but also reconnaissance. We needed to know if your people could be trusted with the valley's secret, if you would share the abundance or try to claim it all for yourselves." Grok had overheard the conversation and was approaching with his massive hands already reaching for his weapons. "Trap!" he growled. "I knew it was a trap from the beginning." "No," Thane said quickly, his voice urgent despite his weakness. "Not a trap. A test. And you passed it, all of you. You could have let me die in the cave and taken the valley stone for yourselves. Instead, you chose to honor an old debt and trust a stranger. That speaks to the kind of people you are." Brack's young face was twisted with anger and betrayal. "You used us. Led us here like prey animals walking into an ambush." "I led you here because both our peoples need this place to survive," Thane replied, his breathing becoming more labored. "But the valley's bounty comes with a price. It must be shared according to the old laws. governed by the ancient customs that kept peace between bands in our father's time. Kira felt the weight of understanding settling on her shoulders like a stone. "A joining," she breathed. "You're talking about joining the bands." Thane nodded slowly. "Marriage between the bloodlines. Shared leadership. Common cause against the winter that grows harder each year." His fevered gaze found hers again. "That's why I couldn't simply die in your cave. The joining must be sealed by choice, not conquest. By honor, not force." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle bubbling of the hot springs and the distant calls of the abundant wildlife. Each member of the band was processing the implications of Thane's revelation in their own way, the promise of prosperity balanced against the cost of giving up their independence as a people. Vera was the first to speak, her pregnant belly making her thoughts practical rather than romantic. A joining would mean safety for our children, protection from other bands who might discover this place and try to take it by force. It would also mean Riverstone customs mixed with our own, Mira observed thoughtfully. Their ways of choosing leaders, of dividing game, of settling disputes. We'd have to learn to live as one people instead of two. "And if we refuse?" Darg asked. "If we choose to keep our independence." Thane's smile was sad but not bitter. "Then you're welcome to stay until spring, to hunt and gather as you need. But when the warm season returns, you'll need to find your own territory. The valley belongs to those who can work together to protect it." Kira looked around at her people, her family in all but blood, and saw the same mixture of hope and fear reflected in each face. The warm valley offered everything they'd ever dreamed of: abundant game, eternal warmth, safety from the harsh seasons that killed so many of their kind. But the price was their identity as a separate people, their independence as the Bone Cave Band. "There's more," Thane continued, his voice growing weaker as the effort of revelation drained his remaining strength. "The joining must be sealed in the old way, with marriage between the bloodlines. A Riverstone hunter and a Bone Cave gatherer, bound together as symbols of the alliance." He paused, his eyes finding Kira's face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My sister Nara leads our band now that I'm dying. She's strong, skilled, unmarried, but Riverstone law requires that the marriage bond be requested by the dying, blessed by the living, and accepted by the heart." Kira felt the world shift around her as she realized what Thane was asking. Not just alliance between their peoples, not just shared stewardship of the valley, but a personal bond that would tie her fate to strangers whose ways she barely understood. "You want me to marry your sister," she said quietly. "I want you to consider it," Thane replied. "Not from duty, not from desperation, but because I've watched you these past days and seen the kind of leader your people need. Someone who can bridge the gap between old ways and new necessities. Someone who understands that survival sometimes requires embracing change instead of fighting it." The weight of his request settled over her like a burial shroud. In the space of a few heartbeats, her simple life as a gatherer had transformed into something unrecognizable, a future where she might become the bridge between peoples, the foundation upon which a new kind of alliance could be built. And somewhere in the mists at the far end of the valley, Riverstone warriors were waiting to learn whether the Bone Cave Band would accept their offer of partnership or choose to remain forever strangers in paradise. The approach to the Riverstone camp felt like walking into a fever dream. Figures emerged from the mist surrounding the thermal pools at the valley's far end, tall, powerful hunters whose heavy brows and thick bones marked them as kin to Thane, but whose bearing spoke of people accustomed to command rather than captivity. They moved with the fluid coordination of a band that had hunted together for seasons uncounted, weapons ready, but not quite threatening. At their head walked a woman who could only be Nara the Swiftfoot. She possessed Thane's intelligent dark eyes and strong jaw, but where his features had been softened by pain and approaching death, hers held the sharp focus of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions for 40 people. Her thick black hair was braided with carved bone ornaments, and her hide clothing bore the intricate beadwork that marked high status among the Riverstone people. "Sister," Thane called weakly, as the two groups faced each other across 20 paces of steaming ground. "I've brought the Bone Cave Band to share the valley's bounty." Nara's gaze swept over Kira's people with the calculating attention of a hunter, evaluating both threat and opportunity. Her eyes lingered longest on Grok, assessing his massive frame and scarred hands, then moved to Vera's pregnant belly, before finally settling on Kira herself. "You look more dead than alive, brother," Nara said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd grown comfortable giving orders. I told you the scouting mission was too dangerous in your condition. The mission succeeded, Thane replied, struggling to maintain dignity despite his obvious weakness. They accepted my guidance, honored the old debt to Eartho Farwalker, proved themselves worthy of the valley's protection. A grizzled Riverstone elder stepped forward, his weathered features skeptical. Worthy by what measure? They captured our best young hunter and held him prisoner. They spared my life when killing would have been easier, Thane countered. They trusted a stranger's word and risked everything on a journey into unknown dangers. These are people who understand the value of honor over convenience. Kira felt the weight of dozens of eyes studying her people, measuring their strength, their weapons, their readiness for either alliance or conflict. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Two bands of survivors who'd learned to trust no one outside their blood family, now forced to consider the unthinkable necessity of cooperation. Grok stepped forward, his massive frame impressive even among the tall Riverstone hunters. "I am Grok Strongarm, lead hunter of the Bone Cave Band," he announced in the formal voice reserved for war councils and treaty negotiations. "We come seeking shared sanctuary, not conquest, but we won't be driven from what we've earned by right of discovery." "Discovery?" A young Riverstone warrior laughed harshly. "We've known of this valley for 3 generations. The secret paths were taught to us by Thane's grandmother when she still drew breath. Yet you never claimed it," Mira the wise woman observed, her scarred features thoughtful. "For 3 generations, you knew of paradise and chose to remain in harder country. That suggests either great wisdom or great fear." Nara's eyes sharpened with interest at the old healer's words. "Both, truth speaker. The valley demands balance. Take only what you need. Share what you have. Defend what you must. When our numbers were small, we didn't need its bounty. When our numbers grew, we feared our presence might destroy what makes it special." "And now?" Kira asked, finding her voice despite the surreal nature of negotiating with strangers while standing in a paradise that shouldn't exist. "Now winter grows harsher each season, the herds grow scarcer, and survival demands risks our fathers would never have taken," Nara replied. "The valley can support both our peoples, but only if we learn to live as one people." Thane struggled to sit upright on his travois, his fevered eyes bright with urgency. "The joining I spoke of, it's not just political necessity, it's spiritual requirement. The first people who carved the sacred paths, who built the markers and the warnings, they understood something we've forgotten. This place has power, but that power demands unity from those who would dwell here." Superstition, his voice loud. After walking the ancient, the weight of his pressing, even the most skeptical among them to sense normal, but practical very much. "Brother, you spoke of a marriage. Do the Bone Cave people accept this proposal?" The question hung in the steaming air like smoke from a sacred fire. Kira felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that dozens of lives, both Riverstone and Bone Cave, hung in the balance of her answer. Refuse and both bands might survive the winter, but remain forever vulnerable to the harder seasons ahead. Accept, and she would bind herself to a stranger whose ways she barely understood, whose people might prove impossible to live beside. "The choice is mine to make," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. "But I would know more about what such a bond would mean, your customs, your laws, your expectations of a marriage partner." Nara stepped closer, close enough that Kira could see the intelligence and strength in her dark eyes. "Among Riverstone people, marriage is partnership in all things, hunting, decision-making, child-rearing when the ancestors bless the union with offspring. The bond is sacred, but not ownership. Each partner maintains their own identity while building something new together. And if we prove incompatible, if our peoples cannot learn to live as one, then we part with honor when spring returns, and both bands seek their fortune elsewhere," Nara replied. "But the joining bond once made endures regardless. That is the price of attempting unity. Some things cannot be undone." Vera shifted uncomfortably, her pregnant belly a reminder of the practical considerations that drove all their choices. What of children born to such a union? Would they be Riverstone or Bone Cave? "They would be valley-born," Thane said softly. "The first of a new people, carrying the best of both bloodlines forward into whatever future awaits." The concept was staggering in its implications. Not just alliance between existing peoples, but the conscious creation of something entirely new, a band that drew strength from multiple traditions while being bound to neither exclusively. Kira looked around at her companions, seeing the hope and fear warring in their faces. Grok's expression was unreadable, but she could sense his hunter's instincts, calculating odds and measuring risks. Mira looked thoughtful, her healer's wisdom recognizing that sometimes the cure was more dangerous than the disease. Even young Brack seemed less skeptical, perhaps beginning to understand that their old ways of life were ending whether they chose change or had it forced upon them. "I need time to consider," Kira said finally, "and I need to speak with your sister alone, to understand the person behind the proposal." Nara nodded, her respect for Kira's caution evident in her dark eyes. "Wisdom speaks through your mouth, Kira of the Bone Cave Band. Take all the time you need. The valley has waited for countless seasons to see two peoples become one. It can wait a few days longer." As the formal negotiations dissolved into the practical business of setting up temporary camps and sharing the evening meal, Kira found herself caught between two futures. In one, she remained who she'd always been, a gatherer, a daughter of ancient traditions, bound to people whose ways were as familiar as her own breathing. In the other, she became something unprecedented, a bridge between worlds, the foundation upon which a new kind of society might be built. Both paths led into darkness, but only one offered the possibility that her children's children might inherit something better than the endless struggle for survival that had defined every generation before them. The thermal pools at the valley's heart created their own weather, wisps of steam that caught moonlight and transformed the landscape into something dreamlike and otherworldly. Kira sat beside one of the smaller springs, her feet dangling in water warm enough to banish the memory of winter's bite, while Nara approached through the mist like a figure from legend. "Your brother sleeps," Kira said, as the Riverstone woman settled beside her on the smooth stone. "Mira gave him herbs for the pain, but she says his time grows short." "I know," Nara replied, her voice soft with grief held firmly in check. "I've known since I saw him on that travois. Thane was always the dreamer among us, the one who believed that hope could triumph over hard reality. Perhaps that's why he survived long enough to bring your people here." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the play of steam across the water's surface. Despite the strangeness of the situation, two women from different peoples contemplating a marriage bond that would reshape both their lives, Kira found herself unexpectedly at ease in Nara's presence. The Riverstone leader possessed a quiet strength that reminded her of Mira, tempered with a dry humor that surfaced when she thought no one was watching. "Tell me about your people's ways," Kira said finally. "Not the formal customs, but the daily realities. How decisions are made, how disputes are settled, how children learn what they need to survive." Nara smiled, the expression transforming her stern features into something warmer and more approachable. "We argue constantly," she admitted. "Riverstone people prize individual strength, but we've learned that survival requires channeling that strength toward common purpose. Leadership is earned through competence, not birth or age. When someone proves they can keep the band fed and safe, others follow willingly. And when they prove incompetent, they find other roles that suit their abilities better, or they leave to seek their fortune with different people. We've no use for leaders who lead through fear or tradition alone." Kira nodded thoughtfully. "The Bone Cave way is more settled. We follow patterns established by our ancestors, modified slowly as circumstances require. Change comes like the seasons, predictable, gradual, tested by generations of experience. Both approaches have merit," Nara observed. "Perhaps together they could create something stronger than either alone. Your people's stability balancing our adaptability, our innovation challenging your traditions to grow. Or perhaps they would simply conflict until both broke apart," Kira countered, though without hostility. "Oil and water can share the same container, but they never truly mix." Nara was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes studying Kira's profile in the shifting light. "Is that what you believe? That we're too different to build something lasting together?" The question carried layers of meaning that went far beyond tribal politics. Kira felt heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the thermal springs, and when she turned to meet Nara's gaze, she saw her own uncertainty reflected in those intelligent, dark eyes. "I don't know," she answered honestly. 3 days ago, I was a gatherer whose biggest concern was finding enough winter roots to last until spring melt. Now I'm being asked to help create a new people, to bind my life to a stranger's, to risk everything on the possibility that cooperation might succeed where isolation has only led to gradual decline. "A stranger," Nara repeated, her tone thoughtful rather than offended. "Is that how you see me?" Kira considered the question seriously, watching steam rise from the warm water between them. "Less so than when we first met," she admitted. "You're not what I expected from a Riverstone leader." "And what did you expect?" "Someone harder, more aggressive. Your people have a reputation for taking what they want through strength rather than negotiation. Nara's laugh was genuine, touched with self-awareness. We do have that reputation, earned through necessity more than preference. When you're always on the move, following herds and avoiding stronger bands, you learn to strike fast and retreat faster. But the valley changes things. Here we can afford to be patient, to build something that lasts beyond the next hunting season. A comfortable silence fell between them again, broken only by the gentle bubbling of the springs and the distant calls of night birds that should have been sleeping through winter, but instead thrived in the valley's eternal warmth. Kira found herself studying Nara's profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way moonlight caught in her dark hair, the competent hands that had probably killed game and enemies with equal skill. Your brother spoke of children, Kira said eventually. Valley-born, he called them, the first of a new people. The thought frightens you. It wasn't a question, and Kira didn't treat it as one. Everything about this frightens me, she admitted. I've spent my entire life knowing exactly who I was and where I belonged. Now I'm being asked to help create something that has never existed before, with no guarantee that it will work, or that our children will thank us for the attempt. Fear can be wisdom, Nara said softly. My grandmother used to say that anyone who wasn't afraid of important decisions was too stupid to understand the consequences. Was she the Stonebreaker woman? The one who taught Thane the secret paths? Yes, taken in a mating raid when she was young, but she came to love my grandfather in time. Their union produced 3 strong sons and 2 daughters who carried the best traits of both peoples forward. Nara paused, her expression distant with memory. She always said that love could grow from respect and shared purpose, even when it didn't begin with passion. The words hung in the steaming air between them, carrying implications that made Kira's heart race despite her efforts to remain calm and analytical. She was beginning to understand that this conversation was about more than political alliance. It was about 2 women trying to determine whether they could build not just a functional partnership, but something deeper and more meaningful. And if respect never becomes love, Kira asked quietly, if we prove compatible as leaders but incompatible as partners in the deeper sense? Nara's answer came without hesitation. Then we honor the bond we make and find contentment in the good we accomplish together. Love is a gift from the ancestors when it comes, but it's not the only foundation upon which a life can be built. The practical wisdom of the response impressed Kira even as it left her feeling strangely disappointed. She realized that some part of her, a part she hadn't acknowledged until this moment, had been hoping for something more romantic, more emotionally compelling than a marriage of political convenience. You're thinking too much, Nara observed with a slight smile. I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, the little line that appears between your brows. Whatever questions are chasing each other through your mind, perhaps you should ask them directly, instead of trying to puzzle out the answers alone. Kira felt her cheeks warm again, embarrassed to be so easily read by someone she barely knew. I suppose I'm wondering whether you want this marriage for yourself, or simply for the good it might accomplish. Both, Nara replied without hesitation. The alliance between our peoples requires a personal bond to make it real, but I wouldn't have agreed to the proposal if I didn't find you intriguing. Intriguing? Intelligent. Strong without being aggressive. Willing to risk everything to honor a debt to a stranger. The kind of person I could imagine sharing not just leadership responsibilities, but the quiet moments between crises. Nara's voice grew softer, more personal. Someone I could imagine learning to love, given time and opportunity. The honesty of the admission took Kira's breath away. She had expected diplomatic evasion or practical calculation, not this quiet vulnerability that revealed depths she hadn't suspected beneath Nara's leadership facade. The joining ceremony would take place at dawn, Nara continued. Sacred words spoken beside Thane's deathbed, witnessed by both bands, blessed by whatever spirits watch over this valley. After that, there would be no turning back. Not for us, not for our peoples. Kira closed her eyes and tried to imagine that future, standing beside this woman as they spoke vows in languages older than memory, binding their fates together, while a dying man's last wish brought 2 tribes into unity. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a leap into darkness that might end in flight or falling. When she opened her eyes again, Nara was watching her with patient attention, waiting for whatever decision would shape both their lives. In the distance, Kira could hear the quiet sounds of 2 camps settling into uneasy sleep, her people and Nara's, soon to be one people or forever strangers sharing paradise. Ask me again at dawn, Kira said finally. "When your brother can hear my answer and know that his last wish has been honored or refused with full understanding of what it means." Nara nodded, accepting the delay with the grace of someone who understood that some decisions could not be rushed. "Until dawn, then," she said, rising to her feet with fluid economy of motion. "Whatever you choose, know that it comes from courage rather than fear. That alone makes you worthy of respect." As the Riverstone leader disappeared into the mists, Kira remained beside the thermal pool, her feet still dangling in the impossibly warm water, while her mind wrestled with the most important decision of her life. By dawn, she would either remain Kira of the Bone Cave Band or become something entirely new, a bridge between peoples, a foundation upon which the future might be built. The steam rose around her like the breath of sleeping spirits, and somewhere in its shifting patterns, she thought she could see glimpses of all the paths her life might take from this moment forward. Dawn came to the warm valley like a whisper, pale light filtering through the eternal mists to reveal both bands gathered in a rough circle around Thane's makeshift deathbed. The Riverstone hunter had declined rapidly through the night, his breathing so shallow that Kira had to watch his chest carefully to confirm he still lived, but his eyes remained bright with fevered intelligence, fixed on her face as if he could read the decision she had yet to speak aloud. Mira knelt beside him with her collection of healing herbs, though they both knew no medicine could turn back the damage that had taken root too deep in his body to cure. The old wise woman's scarred features were gentle as she offered him water from a carved gourd, supporting his head while he drank with the careful patience of someone who had eased many deaths over the years. "Sister," Thane whispered, his voice barely audible above the bubbling of the nearby thermal springs. "Are you ready to speak the binding words?" Nara moved closer, her expression controlled, but her eyes revealing the grief she held in check for the sake of her responsibilities as leader. "If Kira of the Bone Cave Band accepts the proposal, yes, the ceremony can begin whenever she gives her answer." All eyes turned to Kira, and she felt the weight of two people's futures pressing down on her shoulders like the burden of carrying water up from distant streams. She had spent the remaining hours of night in restless contemplation, weighing hope against fear, tradition against necessity, the familiar comfort of her old life against the terrifying promise of something unprecedented. "I accept," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Let the joining be sealed according to the old laws, witnessed by both bands, blessed by whatever spirits watch over this valley." A collective exhale seemed to ripple through the gathered crowd, relief from some, apprehension from others, but a general sense that a crucial threshold had been crossed. There would be no turning back now, no retreat to the safety of separation and mutual mistrust. But as Grok began to speak the formal words of witness, Thane raised one trembling hand, his fevered eyes suddenly bright with urgent intensity. "Wait," he whispered, the word carrying enough authority to silence even the massive hunter. "There is one more thing, one final request that must be spoken before the words are said." Kira felt ice forming in her stomach at the tone of his voice. This was not the peaceful settling of affairs she had expected, but something that carried the weight of terrible necessity. Around the circle she could see her people tensing, hands moving instinctively toward weapons, as primitive instincts responded to the scent of approaching danger. "What is it, brother?" Nara asked, though her own voice carried new caution. Thane's gaze moved slowly around the circle, taking in each face with the intensity of someone memorizing details for a final accounting. When he spoke again, his words came with the labored precision of a dying man using his last breath for something crucial. "The valley demands balance," he began, each word an effort. "I learned this from our grandmother's stories, from the warnings carved in the ancient paths. Those who would dwell here must prove they can sacrifice for the common good, not just speak of it, but demonstrate it with blood and pain." "What kind of sacrifice?" Mira asked, her healer's instincts already sensing the direction of his words. "The joining of our peoples cannot be sealed with words alone. The spirits of the first people require a price, a willing gift that shows both bands understand the cost of unity." Thane's eyes found Kira's face again, and she saw in them a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo from the very bones of the earth. "You must kill me," he whispered. "Not let me die from wounds and fever, but grant me the death of a warrior, with your own hands before both peoples. Only then will the valley accept the alliance as true." The words fell into silence so complete that even the thermal springs seemed to stop bubbling. Kira felt the world tilt around her as she processed what Thane was asking, not just her acceptance of marriage to his sister, but her direct participation in his death. The transformation from healer to killer, witnessed by everyone she had ever known. "No," she breathed, the refusal torn from her throat before conscious thought could stop it. "I won't. I can't." "You must," Thane replied, his voice gaining strength from desperation. "The ancient markers, the symbols we followed to reach this place, they tell the story of the first joining. Two bands who became one only after their leaders proved they could put unity above personal comfort. The woman who would be bridge between peoples must show she understands that some bonds can only be forged in blood." Nara's face had gone pale with horror and understanding. "The spiral carvings," she whispered. "The patterns that seemed to shift in the firelight. They weren't decorative, they were historical, recording the first joining ceremony." "Grandmother told me the true story when I was barely old enough to understand," Thane confirmed. Two bands met at this valley during the hardest winter in living memory. Food was scarce, trust was scarcer, and both groups knew that cooperation meant survival while conflict meant death. But the joining required a price that proved both sides willing to sacrifice for the greater good. Young Brack stepped forward, his face twisted with revulsion. "You're asking her to murder you, to stain her hands with blood for the sake of some ancient superstition. I'm asking her to grant me the death of a warrior, instead of letting me waste away like a diseased animal," Thane replied with quiet dignity. "And yes, to prove that the alliance between our peoples is sealed by something deeper than convenience. Blood shared willingly, death accepted honorably, unity purchased at a price both sides understand." Kira looked around the circle at the faces of her people, Grok's calculating expression as he weighed the political implications, Vera's protective instincts warring with practical necessity, Mira's healer's wisdom recognizing that sometimes mercy required actions that appeared cruel. Even Dag, young and idealistic, seemed to understand that they had moved beyond simple questions of right and wrong into territory where survival demanded sacrifices that would have been unthinkable in safer times. "The choice is yours," Thane continued, his eyes never leaving Kira's face. "Accept my final request and seal the joining with the price the valley demands, or refuse and take your people back to their cave to face whatever winter brings. But know that if you choose mercy for me, you choose potential death for everyone who depends on you." The weight of the decision pressed down on Kira like the stone ceiling of the deepest caves. Everything she had believed about herself, her role as a gatherer, her instincts toward healing rather than harming, her understanding of her own moral boundaries, was being tested by a request that seemed to come from the valley itself, rather than from any human calculation. In the growing light of dawn, with steam rising around them like the breath of ancient spirits, she realized that Thane's final gift to both peoples was not just the knowledge that had brought them to this paradise, but the opportunity to prove they were worthy of keeping it. The question was whether she had the strength to pay the price he demanded, or whether mercy would prove to be another word for the cowardice that doomed everyone she loved to slow death in the frozen wasteland beyond the valley's protective warmth. The silence stretched between heartbeats, each moment pregnant with the weight of a decision that would echo through generations. Kira stared down at Thane's fevered face, seeing in his dark eyes not the desperate calculation of someone bargaining for advantage, but the quiet resolution of a man who had found meaning in his own death. Around them, 40 people from two bands waited to learn whether their future would be built on ancient foundations or crumble under the weight of modern squeamishness. "The old laws demand blood," Mira said quietly, her scarred features thoughtful as her healer's mind processed the implications. "Not from cruelty, but from understanding. Pain shared willingly creates bonds that comfort never can. I've seen it in the sacred hunts, in the ceremonies that mark a child's passage to adulthood. Some truths can only be learned through the shedding of blood. And some truths are lies dressed in tradition," Brack countered, his young voice sharp with moral outrage. "Murder is murder, regardless of what ancient symbols say. We're people, not animals. We can choose to be better than our ancestors' bloody customs." Grok's massive frame shifted as he considered the debate with a hunter's practical wisdom. "The question isn't whether it's murder," he rumbled. "The question is whether it's necessary. If the valley truly demands this price for sanctuary, then refusing might doom both bands to death by degrees. Better one planned death than 40 slow starvations. But what if it's not necessary?" Vera asked, her hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. What if this is just one dying man's delusion, born of fever and the approach of death? What if we stain our hands with blood for nothing more than superstition? Nara knelt beside her dying brother, her expression torn between grief and the terrible weight of leadership. Thane, are you certain? Absolutely certain that this price must be paid? The carvings in the sacred cave, Thane whispered, his voice growing weaker with each word. Grandmother showed them to me when I was barely old enough to walk. The first joining required the willing death of the Stonebreaker leader's son at the hands of the River People woman who became the bridge between worlds. Their blood mixed in the earth. And the valley accepted both peoples as one. He paused, gathering strength for what might be his final words. Without that sacrifice, the alliance fails. The valley rejects those who claim its bounty without proving their commitment to unity. Both bands wither and die, separately, having touched paradise but lacking the courage to pay its price. Kira felt the truth of his words resonating in her bones, though whether from genuine spiritual insight or simply the terrible weight of necessity, she couldn't say. The valley around them pulsed with life that shouldn't exist, eternal warmth in the depths of winter, abundance where scarcity ruled everywhere else, peace between natural enemies who elsewhere fought to the death over the smallest scraps of territory. Such miracles demanded payment. The only question was whether she possessed the strength to be the instrument of that payment. If I do this thing, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, what happens to me afterward? How does someone live with the knowledge that they've taken a life deliberately even for the greatest good? You carry the weight, Nara replied simply, as all leaders must carry the weight of decisions that cause pain in service of preventing greater suffering. The burden becomes part of who you are, but it doesn't have to destroy who you might become. Thane's hand moved weakly toward the bone knife at his belt, the sacred blade every warrior carried for final ceremonies and desperate moments. Make it swift, he whispered. One clean cut across the throat. No hesitation, no prolonged suffering. Grant me the death of a hunter, not the lingering agony of an invalid. Kira's hands trembled as she reached for the knife, its bone handle worn smooth by generations of hands. The blade was sharp enough to part flesh like water, its edge honed to the perfection that only came from constant use and religious care. In the growing light of dawn, it seemed to gleam with its own inner fire. The words must be spoken, Thane continued, his eyes now fixed on the brightening sky above. The old formula that binds two peoples as one. Nara knows them. She's memorized every phrase our grandmother taught. Nara's voice broke as she began the ancient chant, her words rising and falling in the rhythmic cadence of ceremony, older than memory. By blood, freely given. By death, willingly accepted. By sacrifice offered in love rather than fear. Let two peoples become one people. Let the boundaries dissolve. Let the old quarrels die. Let the children yet unborn inherit unity where their parents knew only division. Kira raised the knife, its point catching the first rays of true sunlight as they penetrated the valley's eternal mist. She could feel Thane's pulse beneath her fingertips as her free hand steadied his head, strong and steady despite the fever that was consuming him from within. By this blade blessed in sacred ceremony, by this blood spilled in willing sacrifice, by this death transformed into life for generations yet to come, I seal the bond between Riverstone and Bone Cave, between tradition and innovation, between the wisdom of ancestors and the hope of descendants. The knife felt impossibly heavy in her grip, weighted with the future of everyone she had ever loved. One swift motion would transform her from healer to killer, from follower to leader, from Kira of the Bone Cave Band to something entirely new, the first of the Valleyborn, the bridge upon which a new people might be built. Do it, Thane whispered, his eyes bright with fever and profound peace. Grant me the honor of dying for something greater than myself. Let my blood water the ground where our children will play in safety, where abundance replaces scarcity, where unity conquers the fear that has divided us for countless generations. Kira closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the blade in her hand, the warmth of Thane's pulse beneath her fingers, the breath of 40 people holding themselves still in anticipation of transformation. When she opened them again, her vision was clear, her purpose certain. The blade moved with the swiftness of striking lightning, parting flesh and severing the great vessels of the throat in one clean motion. Thane's blood flowed onto the warm earth beside the thermal springs, steaming in the cool air as his life drained away with the dignity of a warrior's death. His eyes remained open and aware until the very end, watching the steam rise from his blood as if seeing in it the future he had died to create. When the light finally faded from his gaze, his face held the profound peace of someone who had completed the purpose for which he was born. In the silence that followed, Kira felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not just grief for the life she had taken, but a sense of crossing a threshold from which there could never be any return. She was no longer who she had been that morning. Whether what she had become was something better or something irredeemably damaged remained to be seen. But as Nara's arms closed around her shoulders in an embrace that spoke of shared burden and mutual understanding, as the representatives of both bands knelt to touch the blood-warmed earth in acknowledgement of the sacrifice that had been made, Kira began to understand that some transformations could only be completed through the willing acceptance of impossible choices. The Valley of Wonders had accepted its newest guardians, sealed by blood and bound by sacrifice. What grew from that foundation would depend on whether love could indeed bloom from respect, whether unity could prove stronger than the forces that sought to tear it apart. The sun rose fully over the valley's rim, burning away the morning mists to reveal a paradise that two peoples would now share as one. The blood price had been paid. The joining was complete, and in the warm earth where Thane's life had ended, the first seeds of a new future had been planted in soil watered by willing sacrifice. 3 moons had passed since the joining ceremony, and the warm valley had transformed from a place of desperate refuge into something resembling home. The combined band had settled into rhythms that blended Riverstone adaptability with Bone Cave tradition, creating new customs from the marriage of old ways. Children who had been enemies now played together beside the thermal pools, their laughter echoing off canyon walls that had witnessed countless such transformations over the ages. But for Kira, the weight of that morning's choice had never fully lifted. She sat beside Thane's burial cairn as she did each dawn, watching steam rise from the hot springs while the valley awakened around her. His bones lay beneath stones that both peoples had carried and placed with ceremony, marking not just a grave but the foundation upon which their unity had been built. The earth around the cairn had grown rich and dark, nourished by blood that had soaked deep into soil that would feed plants for generations to come. "You carry it too heavily," Nara said, settling beside her on the warm stone. 3 months of marriage had taught each woman to read the other's moods, to recognize the signs of internal struggle that words couldn't always express. "Thane's death was his gift to our peoples, not your crime against him." "I know," Kira replied, though her voice carried the weight of someone still working to believe her own words. "My mind understands the necessity, the honor in what was done, but my hands remember the warmth of his blood, and my dreams echo with the sound of his final breath." Around them, the bustling life of the combined band continued its daily dance of survival and prosperity. Grok worked with Riverstone hunters to develop new techniques for taking the abundant game, while Mira shared her healing knowledge with shamans who brought different herbs and different wisdom to the ancient art of mending bodies and spirits. The integration had not been without friction, but it had been successful beyond anyone's most optimistic hopes. "The children born this winter will never know the hunger that drove our parents to desperation," Nara observed, watching a group of young ones chase fish in the shallow pools. "Vera's daughter was the first, but she won't be the last of the valley-born. In a generation, the unity that cost us so much pain will seem as natural as breathing." Vera's child had indeed been born healthy and strong, delivered in the warmth of the thermal caves, while snow fell thick on the valley's rim. The baby showed features from both bloodlines, her father's heavy brow softened by her mother's gentler jaw, dark eyes that held intelligence and strength in equal measure. She would grow up never knowing the fear of starvation, the terror of raiders, the desperate calculations that had driven every decision her parents' generation had ever made. "Do you think he knew?" Kira asked suddenly. "Thane, I mean. Do you think he understood what his request would do to me? Not just in the moment, but afterward." Nara was quiet for a long time, her gaze following the flight of birds that wintered in the valley's eternal warmth instead of fleeing south like their cousins in the harsh country beyond the rim. "I think he knew exactly what he was asking," she said finally, "and I think he trusted you to be strong enough to bear it. Not because the burden was light, but because the person you would become through carrying it was needed by our people." "The person I would become," Kira repeated thoughtfully. "Sometimes I feel like I'm 2 people now, the gatherer who existed before, and the leader who was born in blood beside his deathbed. They don't always agree on what choices to make. Good, Nara said with quiet conviction. Leaders who feel no conflict about difficult decisions are dangerous to those who depend on them. The tension between your compassionate nature and your willingness to make hard choices when necessary, that's what makes you someone worth following. As if summoned by their conversation, young Brack approached through the morning mist, his face bearing the excitement of someone with important news to share. In the months since the joining, he had grown from skeptical youth to one of the most effective scouts in the combined band, his sharp eyes and quick thinking making him valuable for ranging beyond the valley's borders. "Riders approaching from the east," he reported, his breathing quick from running. "Stonebreaker colors but moving under a peace branch. They're flying the symbols for treaty talk, not war." Kira felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. The Stonebreakers had been quiet since winter's arrival, but everyone knew that spring would bring new challenges, as other bands discovered the valley's existence and decided whether to seek alliance or attempt conquest. "How many?" Nara asked, already shifting into the alert focus that marked her as a war leader, despite the valley's peaceful rhythms. 12 riders, led by a woman in chief's regalia. Old, but she sits her mount like someone who still knows how to use the weapons she carries. Grok emerged from the morning shadows, his massive frame moving with surprising quiet. "Stonebreaker chiefs don't travel without reason," he observed. "If Korvala Bearkiller has come herself, then whatever she wants to discuss carries the weight of life and death for many people." The name sent ripples of recognition through the gathered leaders. Korvala was legendary among the scattered bands, a woman who had united 3 Stonebreaker clans through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless pragmatism. Her presence at the valley's edge meant that the period of peaceful isolation was ending, perhaps forever. "We meet them at the threshold stones," Kira decided, falling naturally into the role of decision-maker that had evolved from her position as bridge between the peoples. Full ceremony, with representatives from both original bands. Whatever they want, they'll see that Riverstone and Bone Cave truly have become one people. The threshold stones marked the valley's formal entrance, ancient markers carved with the same spiral symbols that had guided them through the hidden paths. Here, generations of guardians had met with outsiders seeking entry, determining who would be welcomed and who would be turned away from paradise. Korvala Bearkiller proved to be a woman whose reputation fell short of the reality. Ancient by the standards of their harsh world, she nonetheless radiated the kind of physical presence that made younger warriors step aside without conscious thought. Her weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, but her dark eyes held the intelligence of someone who had learned to survive through strategy as much as strength. "So," she said without preamble as the 2 parties faced each other across the ceremonial ground, "the rumors are true. Riverstone and Bone Cave have indeed learned to share the valley's gifts without killing each other over them." "We have," Kira replied with formal dignity. "The ancient ways were honored, the price was paid, and 2 peoples became one. We welcome Stonebreaker traders and allies, but we will defend our home against those who come as conquerors." Korvala's laugh was harsh but not without humor, spoken like someone who has learned the weight of leadership through trial rather than inheritance. "I respect that, even if I don't necessarily fear it." She gestured toward the valley spread out below them. "Your sanctuary is impressive, but it's also visible from the high country to anyone who knows where to look. Word is spreading among the bands. By spring melt, every hunter-gatherer group within 100 days' march will know of this place's existence." "And?" Nara asked, her hand resting casually on her weapon's hilt. "And some will come seeking alliance, as you hope," Korvala continued. "But others will come with conquest in mind, believing that abundance shared among many is less valuable than abundance hoarded by a few. The valley can support perhaps twice your current numbers. Beyond that, you'll face the same choices that have plagued our peoples since the ice first began its retreat. Who lives, who dies, and who makes those decisions?" Kira felt the truth of the words settling into her bones like winter cold. The paradise they had found was not an ending but a beginning, the first step toward challenges that would test their unity in ways the simple joining of 2 bands had never anticipated. "What do you propose?" she asked. "Her greater alliance," Korvala replied without hesitation. 5 Stonebreaker clans bound to your valley people through the old ceremonies, sharing both the sanctuary's benefits and the responsibility of defending it against those who would take it by force. The price would be steep, blood bonds that tie our leadership to yours, customs blended until no one remembers which began where, children raised as members of one great people rather than as members of rival bands. The proposal was staggering in its implications, not just the expansion they had expected, but transformation into something unprecedented, a confederation of hunter-gatherer bands large enough to defend territory, stable enough to develop new technologies, unified enough to pass knowledge and resources between groups that had warred for generations. The ceremonies required would make our joining look simple, Nara observed quietly. Blood bonds linking dozens of leaders, oaths that bind entire bloodlines, sacrifices that prove commitment beyond question. Yes, Korvala agreed, and the cost in individual freedom would be equally steep. No more wandering, no more following herds wherever they might lead, no more independence from the decisions of others. Those who joined such an alliance would be committing their descendants to a way of life that has never been tried on such a scale. Kira looked down at the valley where children played beside thermal pools, where elderly members of both bands shared stories and wisdom, where pregnant women could give birth in warmth and safety instead of cold caves that might become tombs for mother and child alike. The price of maintaining this sanctuary was rising with each passing day, but the alternative was to watch it slip away as stronger forces inevitably discovered and claimed what they could not defend alone. "When would you need our answer?" she asked. "Before spring melt," Korvala replied. "Other bands will begin moving with the first warm weather, and alliances forged in desperation are weaker than those built with time for proper ceremony. If we're to become one people, the bonds must be in place before the fighting season begins." As the Stonebreaker delegation departed, Kira found herself once again standing beside Thane's grave, watching steam rise from the thermal springs in the pale afternoon light. The unity he had died to create was already growing beyond anything he could have imagined, but the principles remained the same: sacrifice for the common good, willingness to pay whatever price survival demanded, the courage to become something new rather than clinging to comfortable traditions that led only to slow extinction. "What would you counsel now?" she asked the silent stones that marked his resting place. "How far are we willing to go? How much of who we were are we prepared to sacrifice for who we might become?" The answer, when it came, seemed to rise from the earth itself, not in words but in understanding that flowed through her like the warmth from the springs. Unity had a price that grew with each new member it embraced, but the alternative was not the preservation of purity, but the gradual erosion of everything they had fought to protect. The Valley of Wonders would demand new sacrifices, new ceremonies, new transformations that pushed the boundaries of everything their ancestors had believed possible. But for the first time since that terrible morning, when she had taken Thane's life to seal the original joining, Kira felt not the weight of past choices, but the promise of future possibilities. The gatherer who had once worried only about finding enough winter roots was gone forever, transformed into someone who could envision a world where abundance replaced scarcity, where cooperation conquered fear, where the children yet unborn would inherit something better than the endless struggle that had defined every generation before them. It would require everything they had and more than they thought they could give. But as the sun set over the valley's western rim and the eternal mists began their nightly dance among the thermal pools, Kira felt the quiet certainty that the price, whatever it proved to be, would be worth paying. The joining of two bands had been only the beginning. What grew from that foundation would echo through the ages, changing not just their own lives but the very nature of what it meant to be human in a world where survival no longer had to be a solitary struggle against overwhelming odds. Thane's final gift had been greater than he ever knew, not just the unity of Riverstone and Bone Cave, but the seed of transformation that would eventually reshape the relationship between all the scattered peoples who had forgotten that cooperation could be stronger than competition. The Valleyborn would carry that knowledge forward, one generation at a time, one alliance at a time, until the world itself reflected the wisdom purchased with willing sacrifice beside the eternal springs of the Warm Valley.